Well, friends, I'd be glad if you would turn to Job chapter 28. And before we start, I want to mention three little bits of publicity. I think you were given on the way in our little booklet, Prepared to Preach, an introduction to the Cornhill training course. Is that right? Was that given out on the way in? You may be interested to see what the course consists of and how we try to train people. We'd love you to pray for us. And it's just possible there may be somebody for whom it would be appropriate to come to London for a year or even for 2 years part-time and to work for a church and to do that training. And so if there is somebody suitable and they could raise the funds for that, do point them in our direction. If one of you is visiting, if you're in London and you're visiting during our term time, you'd be very welcome to come and just come and sit in for a day or half a day if you had the time to do that. Just send me an email first and make sure that the course is happening then, but we'd love to see you. There's also a little booklet called How Do I Know If Preaching Is For Me? I don't know if that was given out or whether that was given out, was it? That's just a little, it was actually a chapter I wrote in a multi-author book. People keep asking, a lot of our students asking, how do I know if this is God's way forward for me? And it's just, we thought it was worth publishing as a little booklet. It's a free download on our website, so you're very welcome to download it, copy it at your will if you think it's useful. If you don't, then don't. The other thing is that there's a little colour flyer. There isn't one for everybody, but just advertising some of the resources for preachers and Bible teachers that the Proclamation Trust produce. And you might like to have a look at that. They're all advertised on our website. But I want to mention a couple of DVD-based learning resources on teaching and preaching the Old Testament and the New Testament, produced by David Jackman, who started the Cornhill training course, which are relatively expensive. They're about 20 British pounds, so what's that? I suppose that's 120, 140 ringgit, something like that. So it's relatively expensive, but it's a marvellous resource. Andrew, you've got them, haven't you? So you could talk to Andrew about those. Maybe he could advise you as to whether that would be a good resource for training preachers. Obviously, it's in English language. And there's a little Teach the Bible series where we're gradually producing books to equip and resource Bible teachers and preachers. I particularly want to recommend Teaching 1 Peter by Angus MacLeay, which is out recently, which is excellent. And Teaching Amos is very good. I've written Teaching Romans, which is coming out sometime in the spring or summer next year. And I hope that may be a helpful resource. It may not be, of course, but you never know. But there it is. Good. So that was just to mention those. Now, Job 28. Maybe you'd like to turn to page 1 of the handout just to remind yourself of where we are in the book of Job, in the structure of the book. Job has been introduced to us, and we learnt in chapters 1 and 2 what happened to him. And since then we've been involved in those long cycles of speeches with Job and his friends. Job laments in chapter 3, and then we have nearly 3 cycles of speeches. The third cycle is interrupted. And that takes us through to the end of chapter 27. So we're going to pick the story up at chapter 28. My hope is that before mid-morning break, we'll be able to work through chapters 28 through to 37. And then after coffee, we'll come to the Lord's great speeches and the final chapter of the book, and then think a little bit more about the book as a whole. That's my hope. So there's an incentive to stay on after the mid-morning break. Otherwise, we miss the Lord's speeches. That really would be a bit sad. So Job 28. Let me read the chapter. Just to remind us, we've been going through these cycles of speeches And really we've been going round and round and round and round, with if anything, ever-increasing heat and ever-decreasing light. So that the comforters have been getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and what they've said has been less and less helpful. From a low starting point, it's got worse and worse. And Job's laments have continued in much the same vein, with some wonderful high spots. Chapter 19 was one of those, and a lot of low spots as well. But the thing has just been going round and round and round and doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. But the emotional tone has been pretty consistently intense and hot. Now, as I read chapter 28, I want, if you will, you to ask yourselves, what does this chapter feel like, and how does it feel different from the laments and speeches that we've had up to now? I'll try and read it with the appropriate feeling, and then we'll think about that. Job 28. There is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper is smelted from ore. Man puts an end to the darkness. He searches the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from where people dwell, he cuts a shaft in places forgotten by the foot of man. Far from men, he dangles and sways. The earth, from which food comes, is transformed below as by fire. Sapphires come from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. No bird of prey knows that hidden path. No falcon's eye has seen it. Proud beasts do not set foot on it, and no lion prowls there. Man's hand assaults the flinty rock, and lays bare the roots of the mountains. He tunnels through the rock, his eyes see all its treasures. He searches the sources of the rivers, and brings hidden things to light. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Man does not comprehend its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me. The sea says, it's not with me. It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx or sapphires. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper are not worthy of mention. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. The topaz of Cush cannot compare with it. It cannot be bought with pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, only a rumour of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And he said to man, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. My friends, I hope you'd agree with me that that poem feels different from the speeches of the comforters and from Job's laments. It is quieter. There's no it has no smooth connection with the immediate contexts before or after. It doesn't seem to be addressed to anybody in particular, just addressed to the reader in general. It doesn't contain any accusations There's no, you're a windbag. There's no, why don't you shut up? There's none of that in it. There are no complaints. There's no response to anything anybody's said before. It's reflective. It's a pause for thought. And for that reason, a lot of commentators have suggested that this is intended to be a kind of interlude, and that maybe this isn't meant to be Job speaking. I think they may be right. There's no new heading, so it may be a continuation of Job's speech, but new headings are not always put in this kind of literature. And I think it's quite likely that this is a little interlude, a poem about wisdom that's put there by the narrator. Wouldn't matter if it was Job, doesn't really matter who's speaking it. The point is that it's wise and thought-provoking. The structure of the chapter is pretty simple. Verses 1 through to 11 are a little poem about mining. We'll look at them in a bit more detail in a moment. It is, as far as I know, the earliest recorded description of mining in human literature, so far as we know. It's a fascinating little description and poem. After that, in verses 12 through to 22, the poem continues by talking about wisdom in 12 to 22, and we'll look at the structure of that in more detail in a minute. And then in 23 to 27, there is a sort of conclusion to the poem. And then verse 28, it doesn't show in most of our English translations, but verse 28 doesn't share the metre of the poetry. And verse 28 is a prose postscript. It's a very important verse, but it's a prose postscript to the poem, so we need to treat that separately. So that's the structure. As I read verses 1 to 11, I hope you were thinking to yourself, why have we suddenly got a little poem about mining? I hope you were thinking that, because it's always worth looking for the surprises in the Bible. Suddenly, in the middle of this heated, agonizing book, we've got a quiet little poem about mining. And it makes us wonder what it's doing. Two motifs are interwoven in this wonderful little poem. The first motif is that mining is aimed at finding and getting an object of great value, the value of the thing that is mined, whether it be silver, gold, iron, copper, whatever it is. Its value is one theme. And the other theme that mixes in with that is the theme of just how difficult it is to get. What a costly search it is. A valuable object, but a difficult and costly search. As we read through this poem, we'll notice all sorts of ways in which it picks up and just makes us connect in our thoughts with the theme of the book as a whole. So let's go quietly through verses 1 to 11. It is, as I say, a wonderful little bit of poetry. Verse 1, there is a mine. And the moment the poem mentions a mine, we think of a deep and mysterious place. That's what a mine makes us think of. A mine makes us think of somewhere that's hidden and deep and mysterious and perplexing and puzzling and something that's not obvious. And again, verse 1, a place where gold is refined. And the word place just suggests to us that somebody has placed the gold there. It's just a little hint, certainly in the original. The word place is just a hint that there's a purpose there, that something has been placed there for a purpose by somebody. These valuable things have been placed there in a way that makes them hard to find. But they're so worth finding. The gold, the silver, the the iron, the copper, these are valuable things. And that just reminds us that the book of Job is in a way Job's searching for a valuable object or a valuable quest. Oh, that I knew where I might find him. Job 23, verse 3. Why? What's the reason? What's the purpose? In a sense, a costly search for a valuable object sums up much of the book of Job. But it's a lonely and difficult search. Verse 3, man puts an end to the darkness, that is to say, he goes underground. He takes perhaps candlelight underground where there was darkness. He searches the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. It's quite a theme in Job, isn't it? Darkness. The miner has to go into deep darkness to get the object of his search. Far from where people dwell, it's a lonely search. He cuts this mine shaft, places forgotten by the foot of man, miles away from human habitation. And verse 5, there's a contrast between the earth on the surface where you grow food. That's on the surface, that's easy. You can see that. But underneath, it is transformed as by fire. Maybe it's the old mining technique of heating something, heating the rock up with a fire and then pouring water on it so it cracks as a primitive form. We would say it's transformed by dynamite. That's the image there. Here is something violent, dangerous, costly. But verse 6, how valuable, sapphires, gold in its dust. But verse 7, how hard to find, the bird of prey, the eagle or the falcon, the sharpest eyes in creation. They can't see it. It's hidden from them. And the king of the jungle, you see verse 8, proud beasts, the lion, the king of the jungle doesn't go there. So neither the creature with the sharpest eye in creation, verse 7, the bird of prey, nor the most powerful beast in creation can go there. Here is something, a search that is characteristic of human beings alone. Verse 9, man's hand, human hands, assault the flinty rock, lay bare the roots of the mountains, tunnel through the rock, and his eyes see the treasures, searching the sources of the rivers, underground streams, bringing hidden things to light. So we're drawn into this in this wonderful poetry. And the poet says to us, think about a costly, dangerous, lonely search for a tremendously valuable object. Why does the miner do it? Why does the miner hang there in space, as it were, on the mine shaft? Because the object of the search is so valuable. So it gets us thinking about that. And in verse 12, the poet tells us why he's given us that poem. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Wisdom and understanding, synonyms, Hebrew parallelism, they mean the same thing. Just a word on the Bible meaning, the concept of wisdom in the Old Testament. You might like to jot down Proverbs chapter 3, verse 19. Proverbs 3, verse 19, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. And the Old Testament idea of wisdom is something like what we might call the blueprint of the universe. And it's the Old Testament language of the Creator, as it were, building the creation, like building a building, to a blueprint. That's the underlying order according to which the universe is constructed. So wisdom, as it were, with a capital W, not that Hebrew has that distinction, but wisdom, as it were, big wisdom or understanding with a capital U, is, as it were, the blueprint or the architecture of the universe, the fundamental order and shape of the universe. And it speaks of a concept without which the scientific enterprise would be pointless. It's interesting to observe, isn't it, that the modern scientific enterprise has so many of its roots in Christian soil Because unless we believe that there's a creator who has placed order in the creation, there's no point doing science. If it's fundamentally chaotic, there is no point doing science. But it speaks of an order which is not just material, the kind of thing that the physical sciences discern, that kind of order, what we call scientific laws, order discerned in the material universe, but also of an order that is moral, an order that is metaphysical as well as physical. That's what wisdom is. I sometimes use the analogy of the architecture of a piece of hardware or software. You know, sometimes we speak about the architecture, the fundamental shape and order of a laptop or something like that. When my laptop goes wrong, so far as I'm concerned, it might as well be demonized. I have no idea what's wrong with it, because although I did study engineering, it was a long time ago when the wheel had scarcely been invented. So it might as well be demonized. I mean, the best thing I could do is just sprinkle holy water on it, you know, for all the good it would do. But if I can find some techie, as we call them in England, somebody who understands the architecture of it, understands how it works, then they'll be able to answer the question, why has it gone wrong and how can it be put right? That's why wisdom is so important. That's why Job needs to know the answer to it. Why? Chapter 3, verse 20. Why? So there's wisdom in the Old Testament, and this poem is about wisdom. Now verses 12 to 22 again have two motifs interwoven. On the one hand, there is the value of wisdom, just as we had the value of the jewels and the gold and the silver in the mining. On the other hand, we have not just the difficulty of the search, but the impossibility of the search. It's a paradoxical poem, and it's got a sort of sandwich structure. So verses 12 to 14 tell us that wisdom cannot be found. Verses 15 to 19 in the middle tell us that wisdom is so valuable that it simply must be found. And verses 20 to 22 tell us again that wisdom cannot be found. So let's follow this through. Verse 12 to 14. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Man does not comprehend its worth. That is to say, it is priceless. You can't put a price on wisdom, but it cannot be found in the land of the living. And then in the language of Hebrew cosmology, the way the poets spoke about the world, the deep or the sea, that is right down near the gates of Sheol. Sheol, the place of the dead, underneath, spoken of in poetic language as being right down in the depths of the sea. There are the gates of the place of the dead. And if you go down there and you speak to the deep or the sea, as it were personified in poetry, the deep and the sea, they put their hands out like that and they say, "You're looking for wisdom?" In London, if a Cockney, you'd say, "I don't know, mate. It's not with me. I don't know. Even in this extreme, wild place, I have no idea where it's to be found. You can't find it." But verses 15 to 19 just feel the value. It cannot be bought with the finest gold. Everybody's investing in gold just now. That's right, isn't it? Except me. I think I still have a few shares in a bank. Shows how stupid I am. I should have sold them long ago and bought some bars of gold. But all the gold in Fort Knox, all the gold in the treasuries of all the developed nations on earth couldn't buy you wisdom. Verse 15. Nor can its price be weighed in silver. It can't be bought with the gold of Ophir, the legendary best gold in the ancient Near East, with precious onyx or sapphires. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper, well, there's no point mentioning them. They don't come near the price The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. The topaz of Cush in Upper Egypt cannot compare with it. It can't be bought with pure gold. So here is something of infinite value. All the riches and the treasures of a great, wide, wonderful world cannot begin to compare with wisdom. If only we could know the answer to the question, why? To the architecture of the universe. If only we could understand that. We must know. So verses 20 to 22, the question repeated, where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, not just the bird of prey, concealed even from the birds of the air, but from every living thing. And supposing we go and ask destruction, that is Abaddon, the Abaddon, as it were, personified, and death personified. Supposing we go to the place where destruction and death are, right on the edge of the cosmos, and we say to them, excuse me, mate, we're looking for wisdom. They again will say, just like the deep and the sea, worse, somebody once told me they had a cousin who once had a second cousin who once heard somebody who had a great uncle who once thought he'd heard something about it somewhere, but I don't know. That's the point of it, isn't it? A rumour of it has reached our ears. We don't know. So there's the poem. We must find it, but we can't find it. If the poem ended at verse 22, it would be a very depressing poem. Because it would have said to us, we simply must find wisdom and understanding, and there's absolutely no way we ever will. So there's the paradox. Now verses 23 and 24 look as though they might be giving us an answer. Oh, I forgot to say, Abaddon. Sorry, I forgot about this. Abaddon is the angel of the bottomless pit, as in Revelation 9, verse 11. I forgot to mention that. 23 and 24. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows its place, literally. The NIV says where it dwells, but literally it is its place. Picks up that word place from verse 1. And he knows its place because he has placed it in its place. Verse 24, for he views the ends of the earth, the whole creation, and sees everything under the heavens. So there is one who knows where wisdom dwells, who knows the blueprint, who knows the architecture of the universe. And in anticipation of the Lord's speeches at the end of the book, the poet presses his point home by directing our wonder to one of the most uncontrollable and seemingly random facets of the created order, and something that British people particularly appreciate, the weather. British people love verses 25 and 26 because our weather is so completely unpredictable. So verse 25, when he established the force of the wind, that is to say, he gave the wind its weight. He said to the wind, not a weather forecast, but a weather instruction. He said, this morning I would like you to blow north-northeast, force 7. In the afternoon you could shift round to northeast, force 6. And the wind does it. And then he measured out the waters. That is to say, he told the flood waters and the river waters and the seas to go here but not there. We'll meet that again later in chapter 38. And verse 26, he made a decree for the rain. That is to say, he gave the rain its instructions, where to fall and when to fall and how much to fall and how hard to fall. And verse 26, a path for the thunderstorm, literally a way for the lightning of the thunder. That was the mother and father of a storm last night, wasn't it? You're used to it, I gather you have them often. In Britain, we don't have storms like that. We get rather frightened with a storm like that. But the point is, and we'll see this later in the book, the point is that all of these things, the wind, the floodwaters, the rivers, the rain, the lightning, the thunder, he instructed it to go there. So he knows the way to wisdom because he understands and he controls every extreme of the created order. Now, in a sense, the poem has answered the question, where is wisdom to be found? And in a sense, it hasn't. It's said that God knows the way to it, and God knows its place because he's placed it there. But that doesn't help Job very much, because Job is still asking why. And verse 28 is, as I say, a prose postscript, and it's a very important verse. Verse 28 is the first time God has spoken since chapters 1 and 2, and it's the first time that God has spoken in the whole book to human beings. Because in chapters 1 and 2 he only spoke to the Satan in the heavenly council chamber. He, God, said to man, said to human beings, humankind, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. Wisdom, understanding. That is to say, verse 28 directs our attention away from our agonized questions and towards himself, and directs our attention away from our search for the architecture and towards the architect. Why doesn't God answer my question, we say, and the poet says, stop asking your question and seek the God who put the architecture in place. If we were to find wisdom and understanding, we'd become puffed up. As Paul says to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 8, knowledge puffs up. So don't seek wisdom, seek the God who placed it there. And it's very striking that the description of wisdom and understanding in verse 28 is precisely the description of Job in chapter 1 verse 1, chapter 1 verse 8, and chapter 2 verse 3. The fear of the Lord, to shun evil. It's exactly how Job has been described 3 times at the beginning of the book. So this poem in a way says Job is a wise man. He doesn't know the answer, he doesn't know wisdom with a capital W as it were, he doesn't know the answer to the question why, but he is a wise man. But the search for wisdom as an object in itself is doomed. All that is given to us is to fear God and turn from evil, to repent, to believe, to walk as disciples. But when the early Christians reflected on Jesus Christ, one of the Old Testament categories they found themselves drawn to by the Spirit was wisdom, as we know, in his blameless life and his undeserved death and his vindication on the 3rd day. Jesus was and is the wisdom of God, Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, Colossians 2, verses 2 and 3. And Proverbs 28 points to the Lord Jesus Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And in a sense, the early Christians rightly, by the Spirit, discerned that the wise thing to do is to belong to Jesus Christ, who is our wisdom, in whom we do not have the answers to the question why, but we belong to the one who has placed wisdom there and is himself the answer. Let me pause there after that wonderful chapter. It's one of my favourite chapters in the book. I love the poetry of chapter 28, but it'd be a good point to pause and to ask if there are questions or comments anybody would like to make at this stage. I'm very, very happy to take questions. I may not know the answers, but there's good precedent for that. Any questions or comments on Job 28?
when we talk about the sovereign law, knowledge and control, all this. How to explain these things?
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a very appropriate question, isn't it? Because a natural disaster is that's the kind of thing that was the kinds of disasters that had afflicted Job included natural disasters in chapters 1 and 2. They also included crime and terrorism, as we would call them. But they included natural disasters. And so when Job asks why in chapter 3, he is asking why for things like natural disasters. And I think chapter 28 is it's both wonderful and disappointing at the same time, because it doesn't answer the question why. It says to us, it functions as a pause for thought. It says, in a sense, it cools the temperature of the book after all these heated discussions going round and round. And it says, let's have a think about mining. And let's have a think about how mining parallels the search for wisdom and the longing to know the answer to the question why. And just as mining is a difficult search for a valuable object, even more so, here is an impossible search for an infinitely valuable object. And we will never know the answer, because God has placed wisdom there, and therefore the only thing open to us is to fear him and turn away from evil. So it's really saying to us, God is not going to answer our questions, but we must seek him and follow him. So in a way it's a very humbling chapter, because it says to us that although we naturally ask these questions, we wouldn't be human if we didn't ask these questions, God is not going to answer them. And the only thing open to us in verse 28 is to fear him and turn from evil, which is what Job is doing. So it's really saying to Job, you're doing the right thing. You're fearing God and turning from evil. And although you long to know the answer to these questions, God is not going to tell you. Which we find very frustrating, of course, and very humbling. But I think that is what chapter 28 is saying. Because it doesn't work for the school child in what we call the sixth form, what you call it when they're about 17 or 18 years old. You have the discussion group in a school, and the schoolboy or the schoolgirl says, why this, why that? And they're never going to be satisfied with the answer. God isn't going to tell you. But that is the answer we're given.
In explaining verses 1 to 11, you mentioned that perhaps the emphasis is on the very valuable thing and how hard and costly it is to get it. But I was wondering as well if there's another theme behind it, in saying that despite the difficulty in finding it, despite even the sharpest eyes and hardest beasts not being able to go to the place, but man is able to get it.
Yes.
So it's elevation of man's wisdom and ability.
Yes.
And to that sense, in stark contrast with what follows.
With what follows, that's absolutely right. It is a celebration of human ingenuity and human technology, and saying even the eagle, even the falcon, even the lion can't go there, but human beings go there. And as you rightly say, what follows is saying even human beings cannot find wisdom. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, that's really helpful. Okay, shall we move on? Are you happy if we move on to 29 through to 31? Job's final defense speech. I'm going to move a little bit faster through these last 3 chapters of Job's words. (29) verse 1, Job continued his discourse. We're right back into heated speeches and laments, but it's one long speech by Job, 29 through to 31, and you see at the end of chapter 31, the words of Job are ended. He says one or two very brief things later on after the Lord's speeches, but basically this is the end of his main speeches. And the chapter headings, the chapter divisions are exactly right. It does divide precisely into 3, 29, 30, and 31. 29, I'll read through it, but it celebrates the good old days when Job walked with God, when, if you like, he was justified, he was vindicated, he was in good standing with God. Let me read it and comment a bit. How I long for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. In other words, even when there might have been hard times, I had him with me, his light. Oh, for the days when I was in my prime, when God's intimate friendship blessed my house. It's not the blessing that Job is remembering, but the friendship with God, the right relationship with God. When the Almighty was still with me, and my children were around me, when my path was drenched with cream or butter, which is an image we find slightly strange, but is clearly intended to convey wealth and prosperity. And the rock poured out for me streams of olive oil. When I went to the gate of the city, the place of business, and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside. Here's a picture of greatness. Here's a picture of somebody who's as Adam ought to have been. Here's a man who has a role in governing the world. And the young men stand in. Job appears. He doesn't have to push his way through the crowd. They stand aside. The old men rise to their feet. Even the most senior, the elders, stand up in respect for this great human figure. Verse 9, the chief men refrained from speaking, covered their mouths with their hands. They shut up. Job doesn't have to shout to make himself heard. He's treated with great respect. I suppose the nearest we'd have would be if, in the United States, if the president comes into the room. You know, they don't keep, well, maybe at the moment they do still keep talking, but when things are working properly, you know, if the president comes into the room, everybody shuts up. The voices of the nobles were hushed, their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. It's a poetic description of tremendous respect. Whoever heard me spoke well of me. Those who saw me commended me. Why? Verse 12, because I rescued the poor who cried for help. In other words, I did what a human being ought to do governing the world. I rescued the poor. I was given power in order to use it for the poor, and I did. And the fatherless who had none to assist him. The man who was dying blessed me because I cared for him and looked after his family and so on. I made the widow's heart sing. You might like to jot down Psalm 72. In another age, this is a description of the king, how the king ought to behave. The son of David, son of Adam. I put on righteousness as my clothing. That is, right behavior, right relationship with other people. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. It reminds us, doesn't it, of another human being who walked this earth and behaved as Adam ought to have behaved and as David ought to have behaved. Eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger, the outsider, the immigrant, the refugee. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. In other words, I used power as power was meant to be used. And I thought, verse 18, I shall die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. I'll live to a ripe old age. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory, my honour, my ability to stand upright as a human being will remain fresh in me, the bow ever new in my hand. Men listened to me expectantly, waiting in silence for my counsel, because he was so wise. After I had spoken, they spoke no more. Nobody capped Job. When Job finished, nobody said, oh, by the way, I've thought of something else. Because he was so wise. My words fell gently on their ears. They waited for me as for showers and drank in my words as the spring rain. When I smiled at them, they scarcely believed their luck. The light of my face was precious to them. I chose the way for them. I decided policy, sat as their chief. I dwelt as a king among his troops. I was like one who comforts mourners. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it, of a human being walking with God. And he says, I just long for those days again. Verse 30 is very similar to chapter 3. Chapter 30, very similar to chapter 3, but now. Right back to the darkness. Notice the contrast. Instead of being the senior, the one who's treated with respect, now he's the one who is mocked and derided. They mock me. Men younger than I, men who ought to treat me with respect, but they don't anymore, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. In other words, these are good-for-nothings. These are nobodies. These are the dregs of society. What use was the strength of their hands to me, since their vigour had gone from them? These were complete no-hopers. Haggard from want and hunger, they roamed the parched land in desolate wastelands at night. In the brush they gathered salt herbs. Their food was the root of the broom tree. This is a description of the dregs of society, these people whom Job might have wanted to help, but they certainly would have treated him with tremendous respect. Verse 5, they were banished from their fellow men, shouted at as if they were thieves. We know the kind of people he's talking about. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds, among the rocks and in holes in the ground. They braved, they couldn't even speak properly, among the bushes, huddled in the undergrowth, a base and nameless brood. They were driven out of the land. And now their sons, even more junior than them, mock me in song. They write rude songs about me and sing them. I've become a byword among them. They think I'm horrible and detestable and disgusting. They detest me, keep their distance. They don't hesitate to spit in my face. Now that God has unstrung my bow, it's a poetic metaphor for coming near the end of life, and afflicted me, they throw off restraint in my presence. On my right the tribe attacks. They lay snares for my feet. They build their siege ramps against me. They break up my road. They succeed in destroying me without anyone's helping them. They advance as through a gaping breach. Amid the ruins they come rolling in. Terrors overwhelm me. My dignity is driven away as by the wind. My safety vanishes like a cloud. And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bones. My gnawing pains never rest. In his great power, God becomes like clothing to me. I'm not sure that translation's right. Nobody's quite sure. Incidentally, there's more than usual in Job of places where we're not quite sure what words mean. So don't be surprised. There are various places. So if you're preaching Job and you come across a verse where the commentators tell you we're not sure what it means, don't make a big deal of it. just worth being aware of that. We have to live with that. Verse 19, he throws me into the mud. I'm reduced to dust and ashes. I cry out to you, O God, but you don't answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly with the might of your hand. You attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. Surely no one lays a hand on a broken man when he cries for help in his distress. And then there's a rebuke, isn't there? Have I not wept for those in trouble? Hasn't my soul grieved for the poor? I looked after the poor. Why can't you look after me? I thought you were the God who was supposed to look after the poor. Yet when I hoped for good, evil came, 26. When I looked for light, then came darkness. The churning inside me never stops. Days of suffering confront me. I go about blackened, but not by the sun. This isn't a healthy suntan. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I've become a brother of jackals, a companion of owls. My skin grows black and peels. My body burns with fever. My harp is tuned to mourning, and my flute to the sound of wailing. So there's Job's lament. Now, putting 29 and 30 together, the key issue is relationship with God. The key issue is justification, isn't it? Am I in right relationship with God? I long for the good old days when God's friendship rested on me and I could walk with God. And now this is what it feels like not to have God walking with me. So we need to hold those two chapters together in contrast. But chapter 31 really ends with an electric moment. This is Job's final appeal. Think here, courtroom. Think summing up for the defense. Well, actually, it's the summing up for the prosecution. Job is prosecuting God. So think we have God in the dock, except he hasn't appeared. But Job is summoning him to the dock. And Job is the prosecutor. And Job is accusing God of having done wrong. It's high-octane stuff, this. And in Job's final appeal, he protests his innocence. I think it's important for us to be clear that his innocence doesn't mean sinlessness. In the context of Job, it's clear from various points where he recognizes that he has sinned, that he's not claiming sinlessness. But his protestation of innocence is a protestation of someone who is walking, as we would say, in the light. So he goes through a catalogue of sins which, had he done them and not repented, then God would have been right to treat him as he has treated him. But, says Job, I have not done these things, and therefore it's wrong to treat me like this. So first of all, verses 1 to 4, lust. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a girl. This is not the natural desire within married life, but this is outside of that. For what is man's lot from God above, his heritage from the Almighty on high? In other words, what can we expect? Answer, verse 3, ruin for the wicked, disaster for those who do wrong. Does he not see my ways and count my every step? In other words, if I had gone and committed adultery with my neighbour's wife and so on, then God would have been entirely in the right to treat me the way he has, but I haven't. Verses 5 and 6, falsehood. If I've walked in falsehood, my foot has hurried after deceit, well then let God weigh me in honest scales, and he'll know that I'm blameless. And then 7 and 8, covetousness. If my steps have turned from the path, my heart has been led by my eyes, covetous desire, my hands have been defiled, well then may others eat what I have sown, and may my crops be uprooted. And then 9 to 12, adultery. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, I've lurked at my neighbour's door, then may my wife grind another man's grain, may other men sleep with her. For that would have been shameful, a sin to be judged. A fire that burns to destruction, Abaddon, it would have uprooted my harvest. And then 13 to 15, mistreatment of servants. If I've denied justice to my men servants and maid servants when they had a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Didn't he who made me in the womb make them? Didn't the same one form us both within our mothers? You mustn't do that. And then 16 to 18, lack of concern for the poor. If I have denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I've kept my bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless. But from my youth I reared him as would a father, and from my birth I guided the widow. So I haven't done that. 19 and 20, failure to clothe the poor. If I've seen anyone perishing for lack of clothing, or a needy man without a garment, if I'd seen them and his heart didn't bless me for warming him with the fleece from my sheep, if I've raised my hand against supposing I had done that, well, I deserve to be punished. Then 21 to 23, perverting justice against the weak. If I've raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing I had influence in court, because I'm a powerful man and I can get someone convicted even if they're innocent, because, hey, that's how society works. And we know that. If I'd done that, well then, 22, let my arm fall off my shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint. for I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendour I couldn't do such things. And then 24 and 25, putting trust in wealth. If I put my trust in gold, or said to pure gold, you're my security, if I've rejoiced over my great wealth, the fortune my hands have gained, if I'd done that, then I deserve to be punished. 26, 27, 28, worship of the heavenly bodies. If I have regarded, that is, worshipped the sun in its radiance, or the moon moving in splendour, so that my heart was secretly enticed and my hand offered them a kiss of homage, then these also would be sins to be judged. I would have been unfaithful to God on high. And then 29 and 30, pleasure at a foe's misfortune. If I've rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune, gloated over the trouble that came to him, I've not allowed my mouth to sin by invoking a curse against his life, malice against a neighbour. 31 and 32, failure to show hospitality. If the men of my household have never said, who has not had his fill of Job's meat? In other words, his household were always complaining that Job was giving food away to the needy. But no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveller. And then 33 and 34, concealment of sin without confession. You see here evidence he's not sinless. If I have concealed my sin, as men do, by hiding my guilt in my heart, because I so feared the crowd and so dreaded the contempt of the clans, that I kept silent and wouldn't go outside. If I've concealed my sin, then I deserve to be punished. We'll skip the next little bit and just go to 38 for the moment. Abuse of the land. If my land cries out against me, and its furrows are wet with tears, these are sort of ecological sins, if you like, mistreatment of the world. If I've devoured its yield without payment, broken the spirit of its tenants, well then let briars, weeds, come up instead of wheat, weeds instead of barley. So there's the catalogue. That is Job's final summing up. And he's really saying, if I had done these things, if I'd concealed my sin, if I'd not lived a converted life, as we might put it, then God would be entirely in the right to treat me the way he has. But I have lived a converted life. I haven't concealed my sin. I have been penitent. I have changed. My direction of life has been right. And so 35 to 37 is really scary. It's an extraordinary moment of dramatic tension. Oh, he says, that I had someone to hear me. Why doesn't God appear in the dog? I summon God to appear in the dog. I sign now my defence. In a sense, what Job is doing, he places his final signature to his plea. And as it were, he throws it down on the courtroom floor. And the deal in ancient Near East culture was that if you laid down a challenge like that, and you were met with silence, then your accuser was deemed to be guilty. If they came back with no answer, your accuser was deemed to be guilty. So let the Almighty answer me. It's a challenge. He's accusing God of wrong. God is wrong to treat me like this. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. I demand to be tried. I demand to know what the charges are against me. I demand to know what reason is given for treating me like this. Because verse 36, if you did, I would wear it on my shoulder and put it on like a crown. In other words, the moment you tried to put an indictment in writing, it would be quite clear that I was in the right and you weren't. And I'd give him an account of my every step, like a prince I would approach him. So when we get to the end of chapter 31, there is an electrifying tension. This is an impeachment tribunal where God is being impeached. That's the drama of the book of Job here. God is on trial. Job is placing God on trial. Job is saying, if this is how he treats his friends, he doesn't deserve to be God. That's the drama at this stage. At which point, we're bound to be wondering what's going to happen. So maybe we'll stop there and just go home. You stop there and just go home? It's a bad place to stop, isn't it? It's the kind of place that a serial would stop and say, you better come back next week. There's always a hook at the end, isn't there, of an episode? I think we better go on. Let's go on, shall we? Any questions at that point? As I say, very happy to take questions. Yes, my brother.
Would the same challenge be true of a king to someone who serves him, or rather a servant to a king, that it would be expected that the king would respond, otherwise it would be assumed guilty?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think in any court case, if you demanded an answer and no answer was given, the assumption was made that you were in the right. And in a sense, it's still true today, isn't it? If you accuse me of something and I'm silent or I fail to appear in court, it's reasonable for the court to assume that I'm in the wrong and you're in the right. And certainly that does seem to have been the convention in the ancient Near East. And I think that would apply whatever the social status of the two parties. But there's certainly something a little bit scary about doing that with God, which is the drama here. Any others? Okay, shall we have a launch into Elihu? Let's see if we can get through Elihu before the mid-morning break. So we're on page 10 of the handout. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 32. I'm going to read it. I'm going to leave the NIV just for a moment. And I'm going to read it to you from the English Standard Version, the ESV, which tends usually to be a slightly more literal translation. Doesn't always read as well, but it tends to be slightly more literal. And it picks up the themes of these first five verses a little bit better than the NIV. The NIV translates some things differently, and so we don't pick up the repetition. So let me read it to you in the ESV. Just listen, if you would, as I read 1 to 5. And ask yourself what words or phrases are emphasized by repetition. And why does Elihu speak? And what's the critical issue for him? So 32 verse 1, just after the words of Job are ended. So, these three men, that is Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. No prizes. What are the two themes there? Burned with anger is one. He's very, very angry. And the ESV gets it better than the NIV because he burns with anger in verse 2 twice. He burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job. And then again verse 3, he burned with anger at Job's friends. And then verse 5, he burned with anger. Righteous indignation. And the second is the word answer, which the NIV translates differently. So verse 1, these three men ceased to answer Job. Verse 3, they had found no answer. Verse 5, he saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men. So what is the critical issue for Elihu here? Just to glance down at those verses again. What's the critical issue for Elihu? What is it? Why is he so angry? Is he right to be angry? Is not an obvious question. What's driving him? What makes Elihu get up in the morning? What makes Elihu tick? What is it makes him burn with anger? Whose interests does Elihu want to stand up for? Answer, God's, isn't it? Elihu is very angry because he sees a man challenging God and declaring that he's more righteous than God, which is what Job is doing, isn't it? Job is saying, I'm righteous and God is unrighteous. And Elihu is very angry at that. And I think I want to say to us that we ought to be rather sympathetic to Elihu, oughtn't we? I mean, on the face of it, he's got a point, hasn't he? If a human being says God's unrighteous and the human being's righteous, there's something to be said for getting a bit angry, isn't there? Why is he so cross with Eliphaz, Zophar and Bildad? Well, because they haven't managed to shut Job up. They haven't managed to answer Job. They've told Job he's a sinner, but they haven't persuaded him. And so Elihu has waited respectfully, but now he's going to have a go. Now, chapter 32, verse 6, through to chapter 33, verse 7, I'm not going to read. Basically, Elihu says, I'm a young man, you're old. I was respectful, I gave you a chance to answer Job, and I've been waiting, but you haven't managed to, and so having waited patiently and respectfully, I think I've got a right to speak, so now I'm going to. That's roughly speaking what he says there. He says it at some length. Some commentators will say he is a verbose windbag, and that's a cultural judgment. How do we know that? How do we know that in his culture it wasn't a perfectly appropriate way to start? It's typical of British people, and perhaps American people, but certainly British people, speaking as a British person, to make these cultural judgments, to say he's long-winded because he's more long-winded than we would be. It's just arrogance to say that. So if you see a commentator saying he's long-winded, think to yourself, arrogant Western commentator. But Elihu's substantial arguments begin. I want us to notice a really substantial argument in 33, verses 8 to 30. I want us to focus in on this a little bit. And as I read this, why does Job think he's suffering, and what are the answers that Elihu gives? So verse 8, he said he's speaking to Job since verse 1, but now Job, verse 8. But now you, Job, have said in my hearing, I heard the very words. Interestingly, Elihu has been listening. You've said, I am pure and without sin, I am clean and free from guilt. Yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. He fastens my feet in shackles. He keeps close watch on all my paths. That's pretty accurate, actually, isn't it? That is pretty much what Job has been saying. I think Elihu has been listening. Job has been saying, I'm pure in the sense that my sin is forgiven, I'm penitent, I'm walking rightly with God, but God quite unjustifiably has made me his enemy. So Job thinks he's suffering because God has decided to pick on him. (12 and 13), but I tell you in this you're not right, for God is greater than man. Elihu has a great sense of the greatness of God. Why do you complain to him that he answers none of man's words? You see that word answers again. Answer is the big theme here. Why do you complain that he doesn't answer? And Job has been complaining that. I wish I could find him. I wish he would answer me. I'm challenging him to answer me, and he won't answer me, says Job. And Elihu says, why are you complaining he doesn't answer? Because, verse 14, God does speak, now one way, now another. Listen to the two ways that Elihu gives. God does speak, though man may not perceive it. So first way, verses 15 through 18, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn man from wrongdoing and keep him from pride, to preserve his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. So Elihu says God does sometimes speak. Sometimes he gives somebody a frightening dream. And by giving them a frightening dream, he humbles them. He makes them frightened of God's judgment and humbles them. So he does speak. So you mustn't say that he doesn't. Here's the second way in which God speaks, 19 through 28. Or a man may be chastened on a bed of pain. How does God speak? Well, sometimes he speaks through sickness, says Elihu. Constant distress in his bones. If you're familiar with Western Christian writers, you may be familiar with C.S. Lewis in his book The Problem of Pain. In his very, very famous quotation from C.S. Lewis, where he describes pain as God's megaphone, speaking loudly to a deaf world. That's exactly Elihu's argument here. So verse 20, in his sickness, his very being finds food repulsive, his soul loathes the choicest meal, very like Job. His flesh wastes away to nothing, and his bones, once hidden, now stick out. So he's so thin. His soul draws near to the pit, his life to the messengers of death. This is very like Job, isn't it? He says, God is speaking to you, Job. He's speaking to you through your suffering. Slightly complicated the next little bit. I'll try and help us get the gist of it. 23. Yet, if there is an angel, some kind of spiritual being on his side as a mediator, 1 out of 1,000 or 1 of 1,000, to tell a man what's right for him, to be gracious to him. Supposing there's some kind of spiritual intervention for this man, who this spiritual being intervenes, verse 26, graciously, and says, spare him from going down to the pit, don't kill him. I have found a ransom for him. Supposing that, somewhere in the heavenly places somebody finds a ransom for him. Verse 25, his flesh is renewed like a child's, nice clean flesh, restored as in the days of his youth. And he prays to God and finds favour with him. He sees God's face and shouts for joy. He's restored by God to his righteous state. Then he comes to people and he says, I've sinned and perverted what was right, but I didn't get what I deserved. He redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and I shall live to enjoy the light. Now, summing that argument up, 19 to 28, Elihu says, God speaks to people through their sufferings. And he's given you this suffering, Job, and he gives other people his sufferings to warn them of judgment to come. And if you get better from suffering, you need to repent and to say, God has given me another chance, because God has graciously spoken. So you mustn't say he doesn't talk to you, because he does talk to you. He's talking to you now through your suffering. That's what Elihu's argument is. So he concludes 29 and 30, God does all these things to a man twice, even 3 times. Why? To turn back his soul from the pit, that the light of life may shine on him. So there's Elihu's new argument. It's a distinctive argument that Elihu has given at this point. I want to sum up quite briefly how Elihu goes on in his subsequent speeches, because Elihu makes several speeches. So you see chapter 34 as the beginning of another speech. Then Elihu said, and chapter 34 is Elihu's second speech. And just to sum it up, Elihu's big theme is that God governs the world with justice. He has a tremendous sense of the justice of God. So in some ways it's the same as the Comforters, although he lacks the Comforters' malice and unkindness. He's simply concerned to defend the honour of God. So there's the second speech. So he's basically saying to Job, you mustn't question God's motives or judgment. Then at chapter 35, Elihu's third speech. Again you see 35 verse 1. Then Elihu said. And here the theme really is that human beings can't affect God. God is above being affected by us. God is so much greater than us. You can't summon God to answer your demands because he's God. That's the theme really of the third speech. God is Elihu has a tremendous sense of the greatness of God. He says you might be able to summon another human being into court, but you can't summon God into court because he's God and he's above that. Let's take Elihu's fourth speech, which is 36 and 37. And I want to read this to us, and then I want to say a word about what we make of Elihu, because commentators never know what to make of Elihu. Nobody ever preaches on Elihu, because nobody knows what to make of him. Let me read you his fourth speech, just to feel the poetry. Elihu continued, chapter 36, verse 1. Bear with me a little longer, and I will show you that there is more to be said on God's behalf. See, Elihu is God's spokesman, isn't he? He's speaking on God's behalf. That's what drives Elihu. He has tremendous passion and zeal for the honour of God. I get my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe justice to my Maker. Be assured that my words are not false. One perfect in knowledge is with you. In other words, I'm right. And in some ways he is. Verse 5, God is mighty, but does not despise men. He's mighty and firm in his purpose. He doesn't keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their rights. He doesn't take his eyes off the righteous. He enthrones them with kings and exalts them forever. But if men are bound in chains, held fast by cords of affliction, he tells them what they've done, that they've sinned arrogantly to humble them. He makes them listen to correction, commands them to repent of their evil. If they obey and serve him, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. But if they don't listen, they'll perish by the sword and die without knowledge. The godless in heart harbour resentment. Even when he fetters them, even when he punishes them, puts them in prison as it were, they don't cry for help. And they die in their youth among male prostitutes of the shrines. But those who suffer, he delivers in their suffering. He speaks to them in their affliction. He is wooing you from the jaws of distress. It's wonderful poetry, isn't it? To a spacious place free from restriction, to the comfort of your table laden with choice food. But now you're laden with the judgment due to the wicked. Judgment and justice have taken hold of you. Be careful that no one entices you by riches. Don't let a large bribe turn you aside. Would your wealth or even all your mighty efforts sustain you so that you would not be in distress? Do not long for the night to drag people away from their homes. Don't be wicked. Beware of turning to evil, which you seem to prefer to affliction. Affliction's a good thing. Affliction humbles you. This is God being gracious to you, speaking to you through this. God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed his ways for him and said to him, you've done wrong? Well, the answer, of course, is Job has. But it's an outrage, says Elihu. Remember to extol his work, 24, which men have praised in song. All mankind has seen it. Men gaze on it from afar. How great is God, beyond our understanding. The number of his years is past finding out. He draws up the drops of water, evaporation, which distill as rain to the streams. He's got tremendous lots of creation, nature imagery here. The clouds pour down their moisture. Abundant showers fall on mankind. Who can understand how he spreads out the clouds, how he thunders from his pavilion? The pavilion, as it were, in the heavens. Elihu would have loved last night. See how he scatters his lightning about him, bathing the depths of the sea. This is the way he governs the nations and provides food in abundance. He fills his hands with lightning and commands it to strike its mark. Isn't it marvellous poetry? Pow! That's what he does in his greatness and his power. His thunder announces the coming storm. Even the cattle make known its approach. Isn't that right? They lie down when there's a storm coming. At this my heart pounds and leaps from its place. Listen to the roar of his voice, to the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He unleashes his lightning beneath the whole heaven and sends it to the ends of the earth. After that comes the sound of his roar. He thunders with his majestic voice. When his voice resounds, he holds nothing back. God's voice thunders in marvellous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. He says to the snow, fall on the earth, and to the rain shower, be a mighty downpour. It was. So that all men he has made may know his work. He stops every man from his labour. The animals take cover, they remain in their dens. The tempest comes out from its chamber. That is, as it were, up in the firmament of the heavens, the tempests where the storms are stored up. The cold from the driving winds. The breath of God produces ice, and the broad waters become frozen. He loads the clouds with moisture. He scatters his lightning through them. At his direction they swirl around over the face of the whole earth to do whatever he commands them. He brings the clouds to punish men or to water his earth and show his love. But the point is, he does it in his greatness and his power. Listen to this, Job, verse 14. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, those wonders of him who is perfect in knowledge? You who swelter in your clothes. Oh yes, we do, we Westerners who come to Malaysia. You who swelter in your clothes when the land lies hushed under the south wind, the desert wind. Can you join him in spreading out the skies hard as a mirror of cast bronze? Tell us what we should say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of our darkness. Should he be told that I want to speak? Would any man ask to be swallowed up? Don't be so stupid. Now no one can look at the sun, bright as it is in the skies, after the wind has swept them clean. How wonderful, the wind sweeping the clouds out of the skies. Out of the north he comes in golden splendour. God comes in awesome majesty. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness he does not oppress. Therefore men revere him. For does he not have regard for all the wise in heart? Isn't it marvellous stuff? Don't you think? If you read some commentators, they dismiss Elihu as a waste of space. The Bible Speaks Today, little volume 1 Job, which I wouldn't particularly recommend, dismisses Elihu as a waste of space. I think it's wrong. Let me give you a number of reasons why I think we should take Elihu seriously. I'll mention several. First of all, when he's introduced at the beginning of chapter 32, he's given a genealogy. We're told that he's the son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram. The three comforters are not given a genealogy. And a genealogy is often a way of conveying importance. You give someone a genealogy, you're saying they're important. That's why Matthew does it in chapter 1, of course. A very long genealogy. It's a way of saying, here is somebody important, significant. He's given a genealogy. Second, he's not rebuked in chapter 42, where God says to the comforters, you've not spoken. He says to Eliphaz, you and your 2 friends have not spoken of me what's right. But he doesn't rebuke Elihu. Third, Elihu is given 4 unanswered speeches. Nobody interrupts Elihu until the end of chapter 37, by which time he's given 4 whopping great speeches. That's far more than Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar ever get. He's given 4 unanswered speeches. Next, his speeches come at a very important position in the book. This is the beginning of the answers to Job. So he's a kind of, somebody suggested there might be a pun on words, that Elihu is a kind of Elijah figure. He's a kind of forerunner figure. I think he is. Next, he has that helpful new insight that God speaks through suffering. C.S. Lewis's megaphone argument, which is a new insight. Next, he does seem to engage with Job in a way that the comforters never did. He has listened to Job. He's understood what Job has said. He does engage with him. And lastly, he has a tremendous sense of the greatness of God. And musically, if you were setting Job to music, by the time you've read, that's why I read chapters 36 and 37, by the time you've got to the end of chapter 37, we really are ready to go quite easily and naturally into the Lord's speeches. He is a kind of forerunner figure, and all that storm imagery. So that's why IVP, my publisher, got that, I think, that rather good title, Out of the Storm, for my little book on Job. I didn't think of that. I thought of some dull titles, and they came up with that one. The more I thought about it, the more it's a good title, isn't it? Out of the Storm. There. So for those reasons, I think we ought to take Elihu seriously and say he is a kind of Elijah figure. And he's getting us thinking in the right direction. It's not that we're bound to agree with every detail of everything he says. Some of the things he says are a bit like the comforters. Some of the things he says do remind us of the comforters in some ways. So it's not that we can't do systematic theology with Elihu. We can't sort of feed Elihu into our systematics. But in the way that the drama is told, he does get us thinking in the right direction. I think that's his function. I've not preached on Elihu. I think it would be quite difficult to preach a sermon on Elihu on his own. Because it would be like, we're about to stop any second now and have a mid-morning break. But it's like, do you have ice cream vans in Malaysia? Do they play little tunes? Do they stop the tunes in the middle of the tune? Because in Britain, they often play a traditional English tune, which is Greensleeves, which goes dee 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 dee, except that they go dee 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 dee. It just stops in the middle. It's very annoying. And to preach a sermon on Elihu, you'd have to stop at the end of the sermon like that. And it's like stopping Genesis 1 at verse 25, when we're just waiting for humankind to be created. It's a bad place to stop. So he's like a sort of an overture, isn't he? Or the introductory piece of music to what's to come. But we are going to stop. Let's break now. So we'll stop at a bad moment.